And Dana really needs no introduction. She's been here before and talking about her research, but she just completed her PhD thesis on a really interesting topic, looking at people who have difficulties with the board, and that's also the people that we're always working with, and so it was great to see someone taking a look at this, and you know, when we were here before, I think a few times as part of the Rackley research project, and we really enjoyed bringing people in, even in the middle of the research, to hear what they're up to and to provide some feedback and everything, and so we've been thinking for a while we would like to get back into that and try and bring people here on a regular basis. And so that was our motivation, to sort of pick you and your thesis as the first step, and also we like the idea of bringing it out, you know, to a broader audience, and so really appreciate the work that you've done to reduce it into the short piece, and so I'll turn it over to you, Dana, and is it okay if people have questions as you go along?
Yeah, I think this is a fairly informal kind of a thing, and so if you need points of clarification or just questions as we go, I think that's perfectly fine. It's fine by me.
Okay, and Dave's going to watch the Facebook.
Okay, so he writes in. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all coming and for inviting me to come today and for pulling this together on relatively short notice. We're just sort of kind of capitalizing on my visit to Ontario and when I was in Ottawa the week. So I'm delighted to be here, and it's really nice to be back. I was saying to Orlando that I really miss feeling that connection to the community here, and it was so important to my doctoral work. And I really felt that connection. I attended so many meetings, the band prof sessions, and all during RACWE, and coming to community forums, and it was really great to have that community here in Ontario while I was doing my doctoral work, and it really influenced my doctoral work. So today I'm going to be presenting that, and currently I'm a postdoctoral fellow back in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is my home province, at Memorial University, and I'm funded by the Centre for Research on Work Disability Policy, which I suspect is familiar to some of you in any case. And I thought I would take a minute to tell you how I came into this research. For those of you who know my work now, you might be interested to hear how I came to even study problematic claiming. And it came about in my master's work, where in Newfoundland I was in small communities interviewing crab processing workers about an occupational allergy and asthma that they had. And I sort of went into these communities with ideas about what I was going to hear. And I thought I'd hear stories about unemployment, a lot of time off work and illness, and a lot of compensation claiming. That was the story I expected to hear. And I didn't hear any of that. Everybody continued to work, despite being very sick. And nobody, I interviewed 27 people, all of whom were symptomatic or had diagnoses of allergy and asthma. Not a single one had filed a compensation claim. And I just found that to be so surprising. And that then really kind of inspired in me an interest in filing. What do workers even think about compensation claiming? What do they know about it? What are their fears about it? And why don't people report? So I went into my research with an interest in underreporting, recognizing that as many as 90% of work-related injury and disease is not reported. And I sort of really wanted to kind of understand how and why injured workers file compensation claims. So I had sort of a really broad kind of objective guiding this original research question. And to explore that, I sought to recruit both workers who filed, but especially workers who had not filed, who had gotten injured or sick at work, but for whatever reason did not file a compensation claim. But that became problematic because the non-reporters just did not materialize. I might have gotten a couple of people come forward who had not filed a claim, but people who were responding to my recruitment material were people who had filed, and particularly people who had problematic claims. So in the end, my research sample was comprised almost entirely of people with long, drawn-out, complex claims and very adversarial relations with the board, really strained relations with the board. So that was fine. I sort of thought, okay, well, I had to sort of refocus a little bit and really kind of zero in on problematic claiming rather than claiming more generally. And that was okay. This supplied me with what we call an extreme case sample. So being able to see very clearly and deeply the kinds of problems that are arising, the sorts of processes that were involved specifically around problematic claims. So I refined my interest to look specifically at problematic claiming. And as I began to look into that, I saw that in Ontario, there's a small proportion of claims that are considered problematic. This is a word I kind of have assigned to these kinds of complex, prolonged, adversarial claims. And while it's only about 20% of all claims filed, according to research, these claims actually account for about 80% of claims-related costs in the system. So it's an important issue. And in addition to that, these claims are associated, as you all know, with chronic disability, unemployment, financial and emotional suffering for injured workers. And they're also associated from the board perspective with a lot of financial administrative burden. So there's a lot of interest in figuring out what's going on here. So my research objective was to understand the issue of problematic claiming from the standpoint of injured workers. So I wasn't necessarily interested in how the board saw problematic claiming. I was very interested in talking to injured workers and hearing how they understand and practice claiming. And when I talk about problematic claims, that's also from the perspective of injured workers. And that includes people with ongoing claims, where they're not getting any kind of resolution, but also claims that are closed as far as the board is concerned, but the injured workers are still very much engaged in the system with you here, with the injured worker community. They're still very much engaged. So I sort of conceive as injured workers more broadly, not just with open, ongoing claims. So my methodology, I took a qualitative approach, where basically I looked to sort of social theory to kind of guide my research questions and guide how I analyze my data. And it really kind of gave me a lens through which I could look at the data and see new, fresh ideas. And basically what I wanted to do was look at how injured workers understand and practice claiming, and how that kind of experience is produced through local interactions between each other and with the board. But I also wanted to look at how those interactions are situated in sort of the bigger context, the bigger institutional context, and the social context, with things like the discourse of abuse kind of going on and really shaping how people think about claiming. So I did a focused ethnography, which involved 30 interviews. So I spoke to 26 injured workers and 4 worker representatives. I didn't call them key informants here. And I also analyzed documents and texts, and that was really to get an idea of that broader context, to look at how the board thinks about and represents claiming, and also to look at how the injured worker community more broadly understands, talks about, thinks about claiming. So I looked at key documents and texts that were produced by and for the compensation board, as well as for the injured worker community. So for the board, that would be things like the operations policy manual, the act, strategic plans, quarterly reports, all that sort of stuff. And then for the injured worker community, it was all those materials I'd collected, all the conferences and meetings I attended, emails that would come from, that email list out of ONIWIG and stuff like that. So presentations, letters that you've written to, your representatives and those sorts of things. A lot of stuff coming out of injured workers consultants. And then my analysis employed multiple interpretive techniques. So one thing I did was I would read transcripts multiple times. My transcripts of interviews I read multiple times, and I would take different sort of concepts and try them on the data. So I would think about things like fight, like the word fight was used a ton through my interviews, or battle. There's a lot of fight language used. So I began to sort of think about what was that kind of language really describing? Why were they using that kind of language? So I would look at my data through a lens of confrontation, for example, or those kinds of things. And I also spent time really trying to map out the key players and key parts of the process as part of my analysis. And then I'll get into findings. The central finding of my work was that, and this is not going to sound hugely surprising to you, but is that injured workers experience claiming in moral terms. So I found when injured workers talked about their experience of claiming, it used really moral-oriented language. So they talked about their feelings of mistrust in the system, in their adjudicators, in their employers, and their sense that those parties also didn't trust them. So there was a lot of that going on. They also talked about this feeling of being dehumanized, of the system kind of treating them as a case file, not as a person with value and morals. And so this quote here sort of reflects that idea. So this person said, like, it's just, I don't fit into your mold. You're trying to fit, I'm a square, and you're trying to fit me in a round mold. And guess what? It's not going to work. They're going by their program that they've set out for everybody, and everybody better line up and just file right in. So this person's talking about what she felt was a one-size-fits-all sort of program at the board, and how she felt there wasn't enough sort of individualization. Everything was sort of, the board is so focused on standardized kind of processes that they felt kind of just swept up, and their human values were overlooked. Injured workers also talked about this feeling of judgment, and within that feeling, that was sort of broken down into three sorts of experiences. So they talked about this sense of heightened scrutiny around their claims, and feeling that every sort of piece of documentation they submitted was heavily scrutinized. And this quote here reflects that sort of feeling, where they say, the next letter I got from the board, they knock him down, referring to their doctor. And they said we needed more information. I gave them the same information over and over and over, enough to wallpaper Toronto 50 times. And my doctor got so disgusted with it, he just gave up. He said, no more. So just the level of scrutiny and constantly seeking new documentation, they felt it was, I sort of call this sort of a feeling of judgment. And of course, they also felt fairly consistently blame. They felt that they were being blamed for their injury. So it seems that with the WSIB, you're guilty till you can prove you are innocent. And there's a perception of people trying to milk the system, even though they put them almost into bankruptcy in trying to do so. So it's this odd sort of thing where they're being treated as though they're trying to get a free ride, whereas their lived experience is that there's no free ride. Nobody is getting rich off of workers' compensation. And finally, and related to that, is this perception that they're being seen as dishonest, and in fact feeling as though they're seen as outright lying about their condition, its mere existence, or certainly that it happened at work. There's lots of suggestions that, well, maybe it happened when you were playing floor hockey, or suggesting that it happened at home, or feeling as though there are implications that they're exaggerating their symptoms and making them out to be worse than they are. And finally, their moral experience involved this sense of confrontation, and that's where that fight battle language comes in. A lot of their stories involve this kind of, you've got to know which side of the fence you're on, who's fighting for me, and this sort of thing. So this person said, it's a big chain of events that leads to the fact that, okay, who's fighting for me? And if you don't fight for yourself, nothing is going to get done. But they throw up roadblocks. They throw up roadblocks that they can't see you today, or I don't have that information now, or there's always some kind of an obstacle in the way that creates this sort of confrontational adversarial relationship. So all of this, to me, all suggested, it's sort of, it's evidence of workers sort of engaging morally with the compensation system and thinking about the compensation system in moral terms. And further evidence of that moral engagement and understanding of claiming is what I saw and have called identity work. And so through my interviews with injured workers, I saw the way, as a result of that exchange with the system, efforts to really try and repair what they felt like was a damaged reputation. They felt this sort of moral assault, and they felt they were compelled, I think, to try and repair that reputation. And I've borrowed these sort of tools of identity work from an author, Irving, who put forth this concept. And so I thought about these as I looked at my interview data, and I could see strategic use of props, and I saw that as being the documentation, and the documentation that the workers would come to the interviews with just stacks of newspaper clippings, letters from their doctor, letters from the board, and it was constant documentation and the paper trail, right? So always using that in support of their case and their claim. And I also saw, Irving talked about an arrangement of personal appearance, and I never in my interviews saw any sort of attempt to, exaggerate symptoms or anything like that, or to perform necessarily, but I saw an awareness of how important things looked, that it's important to appear sufficiently unwell, especially where your injury might be invisible. So I had an injured worker talk about going to a retraining program despite feeling though she really wasn't up to it because of her back injury. And she described showing up at the designated time and lying on the floor, sort of because that was how she was most comfortable. But also I think to sort of remind people that even though you couldn't see her injury, she was in fact not ready to be back at work and retraining. The other tool was a selective association with others. So you could see throughout everyone's stories that working with finding a sympathetic doctor, somebody who they knew would listen to them and be supportive of their claim and provide the documentation required. Or working with professionals, whether it was people in the legal aid environment or union representatives who were really knowledgeable in the system and could support their claim. And also, becoming connected to injured worker communities and finding support through that. And finally, there was a lot of identity talk. So this was sort of in how they spoke about their injury, also trying to repair what they felt was a damaged reputation, or sort of confront what they believe, how they thought they were being seen as suspicious or criminal or lying and all this sort of stuff. So there was a lot of talk around what good workers they were. They were physically fit. They knew their rights. They were on the health and safety committee. I mean, they were what you call a good worker. Never took a sick day before I get injured. That kind of story. They also talked about that they were legitimate claimants. They described their injuries in great detail. The part of the spinal cord that had been injured, and the array of tests that proved they had a legitimate injury that made them eligible for compensation benefits. And finally, a lot of stories of real suffering, of lost homes and families and financial hardship and that sort of thing. And that, compensation is no picnic and nobody's on here looking for some sort of free ride. So when I found that injured workers were engaging in the system morally, I then turned to why. What accounts for that moral claiming experience? Why are injured workers engaging in this way rather than, say, in more legal terms or economic terms? Why is it more about justice and fairness? In my mind, that was what came through my data, rather than say this is an issue of getting enough money to pay my bills, which is important as well, but that wasn't the sort of the key story I was hearing. So I wanted to know what was shaping this moral engagement. So I basically, I analyzed and found that there were sort of three important discursive contexts that were contributing to how workers understand and practice claiming. And by discursive contexts, I remind you of Joan Eakin's Discourse of Abuse. So it's this idea of these shared ways of understanding, thinking about, talking about a phenomena, and these sort of really dominant ideas about a phenomena, and how those ideas then shape how the language we use and how we sort of see our experiences and understand people's actions and so on. So I discovered, or I put forth, three possible discourses that shape injured workers' experiences. And the first one is the injured worker movement's what I call justice discourse. So through my analysis of all the texts and attending all the meetings, I originally called it the Meredith Discourse, because it was certainly a time when Meredith, and he still is of course, but it was during that 100, this is when I was really kind of working through this analysis. Meredith was really dominant, I think, in the injured worker community, and his principles. But I sort of took a step back from that and called it more broadly this justice discourse that I could see throughout all the texts that I was reading. And within that, I saw within the injured workers kind of, when I spoke to them, I saw two kinds of dimensions of that discourse. They talked a lot about integrity. So there was a lot about learning how to tell your story in a way that was credible and in a way that you would be believed. And then the other piece of that is that the texts and documents, everything was really framed as a matter of justice and fairness, and workers' comp is a right. So it was definitely in more justice terms, as I say, rather than economic terms or something else. And I found that this justice discourse of the movement really gave the injured workers in my study a morally oriented language and justice-related concepts for understanding their own personal experience. So a number of workers in my research refer to the Meredith Principles, refer to what's right and what's fair and so on. You could see the language they used and the things that they drew out as important as reflecting what I saw as that broader justice discourse of the injured worker movement. So make sure I haven't forgotten anything I want to say there. And then the second kind of, and I see these as sort of at sort of graduating levels. So you've got the injured workers experience, and then you've got the injured worker movement's justice discourse, and then you've got kind of layering over that the sick role discourse. And the sick role is a sociological idea. It's quite old, but what I really like about the sick role discourse is it suggests that being sick is actually a social role. So it's not just a state of being, it's not just a medical status. It's a role that comes with expectations and rights. And so sort of sociologically, when sick role was first put forth, it suggested that someone who's sick is expected to have that illness sort of made legitimate or validated by an authority on the matter, whether it be a doctor typically. And they're also expected to try and get better. And they're expected to, by seeking medical advice and interventions, and they're expected to be seen as interested in trying to get better and recovering and getting back to their normal responsibilities as quickly as possible. And the other side of that then is their right is to be permitted a break from their normal responsibilities while they recover. And they also have a right to not be blamed for their illness. So this is sort of the sick role. So I kind of took that lens and applied it to work injury. And what does that mean then for injured workers? And I found that basically it frames sickness as a moral status. And sickness is something that you have to be constantly trying to recover from. And so you can get back to your everyday responsibilities. And for injured workers, this can create a real tension. Because on one hand, if you're wrapped up in the compensation board, you need to appear sufficiently unwell to have a legitimate claim. But then you also, at the same time, need to appear as though that, working hard to get better. So it's struggling with that tension of, as Orlando so eloquently put it, this doing too much, doing too little dance. These tensions around trying to find that right balance. And so in the sick role, injured workers have a hard time sort of meeting some of the obligations of the sick role, around getting better as quickly as, for example, the Workers' Compensation Board would like to see them. And so they sort of wind up in this strange in-between space because the board now is not necessarily seeing them as sick, so they're not permitted those rights of having time off work and being blameless. But at the same time, they themselves aren't feeling healthy, so they can't take on this sort of healthy role. So they're in this weird sort of in-between social space of being able to kind of not being able to take on either role fully. You know, does that make sense? And then finally, the third discourse is this idea of neoliberalism, which I won't get too bogged down in, but the features of, so neoliberalism is sort of an economic theory, but also sort of a more ideological kind of concept around, you know, basically the two key features that I really zeroed in on were within a neoliberal context, which is what we're all living in, there's a real value placed on, I've got it written here as market fundamentalism, but basically shifting the economic power from governments to private market. So having less responsibility for social supports and programs in the hands of the government and allowing more of the economic sort of success to happen at the level of private markets. And what that basically means then is government funding and program support keeps sort of getting diminished and clawed back, and those that do exist are seen as a drain on society because they're getting in the way of markets doing really well, and they're not creating a particularly competitive society or market. And then the second feature of neoliberal context is this real value on individual responsibility, so placing responsibilities for one's financial well-being, one's health, on the individual. So it's not a government responsibility, it's up to you. And you can see that all the health promotion kind of stuff going on now, and in personal, in self-improvement and all that sort of discourse that's out there right now. That's all part of this neoliberal context. And so this neoliberal context then as well frames health and illness as a moral statuses. And it actually frames health as a moral duty that we are expected to achieve. And if we don't, we are seen as deviant somehow, or as not keeping up with social norms and expectations around what we as neoliberal citizens should be doing. And neoliberal context really values people who work, people who are fit and healthy and top performers. These are the people who are seen as good citizens in a neoliberal context. And so then, in such a context where health is a moral duty, injured workers are oftentimes can be framed as deviant, as violating those norms and expectations of good citizens. And then, as I went through looking at those three discourses that are shaping the injured workers' engagement, their moral engagement with cleaning, of course, all the while I was considering what is the role of the board in all of this. And I was reviewing, of course, all those documents and texts that I mentioned and thinking about their role as well through the eyes of injured workers. And I found that the board as well is being, the board's understanding of cleaning is being framed by this neoliberal context. And I could begin to see these values of market fundamentalism and individual responsibility. You can see them very much reflected in the board's texts. So I found that the board, while injured workers see compensation as a very moral enterprise, the board thinks of compensation as being a matter of business. And the board is very sort of preoccupied with the administration of compensation. It refers to employers as customers. It talks about itself as being easy to do business with. Sort of streamlining and modernizing processes and non-discretionary sort of standardization in the board, which really depersonalizes injured workers. And in a lot of the texts I reviewed, injured workers simply weren't there. I mean, they were quite absent from some of the strategic plans, because the strategic plans that I looked at, which were basically from 2008 to 2016, were during that time of the real unfunded liability crush, right, where they were really focused on dealing with their unfunded liability. So those strategic plans, you know, in the 2012 to 2016 one, it had sort of 5 key pillars. 4 of those had to do with dealing with basically the financial, like the bottom line of the board and dealing with financial matters, and one kind of really focused on injured workers. So you can sort of see where their priorities were. And this all reflects these neoliberal ideas of financial efficiency and austerity and managing, one's finances. And so then that was the other sort of key focus of the board. It was compensation is a matter of business, and it's also a matter of financial efficiency. How does the board meet the competing demands of employers and workers, but while sort of managing that unfunded liability? And so its measures of success, that it would report on were reduced lost time claims, fewer claims coming in, workplaces are safer. These were the measures of success, because they meant fewer costs, of course, for the board. So what does all this mean for problematic claiming? Well, it means that injured workers and the board really conceive compensation claiming in very different and conflicting ways. And this has implications for how each party interprets the other. So, as I talked to injured workers, they talked about the process, the eligibility and the requirements of the board, which you could just see as simply being about ascertaining their eligibility for benefits. But injured workers really saw all of these requirements for documentation as roadblocks and as basically attempts looking for ways to deny their claim. If you continually ask for documentation, at some point it won't be there and we can deny the claim. Or we can just frustrate people to the point of abandoning claims. This is how injured workers really perceived the requests from the board, because they were looking at the board from a moral perspective, and they were feeling they acknowledged or recognized, they felt this perception of being seen as lying and looking for free rides and so on. And on the other hand, the board, which was so focused on really trying to manage that unfunded liability, may have seen injured workers who are fighting particularly hard to support their claim as being suspicious. If they fought too hard for their claim, that was almost a little bit, that kind of got their spidey senses going a little bit, They began to sort of see this worker with a bit more suspicion, because, they were sort of seen as being an impediment to keeping their claims down and their lost time payout benefits down. And it also affected how both sides sort of looked at blame. Injured workers felt blame in a really kind of moral way, and they responded to it through that identity work, where they sort of continually positioned themselves as good workers and legitimate claimants and so on. But the board dealt with claim a little bit differently. So it's a no-fault system, and it was really important to the board that blame be removed from the system. And they did this by really kind of digging in on eligibility requirements and making sure the system was non-discretionary. So there's no blame here. It's all very standardized. It's all very by the book. But by doing that, actually, it sort of produced a sense of blame, because by doing things so by the book and having these very tight eligibility requirements and asking injured workers to meet those requirements, injured workers felt blamed. So the board's very activity to dissolve blame actually created a sense of blame in the injured workers. I'm arguing. So just to kind of finish up, I'm not going to dwell on this slide. This is just sort of where I suggest how my research contributes to the field of work and health, right? So as I've just described, it really identifies these really irreconcilable conceptions of claiming as they currently are. And what's going on is both sides are becoming further and further entrenched in their own positions. And the more, it's possible that the more injured workers sort of fight on moral grounds, the more the board is actually becoming more entrenched on the eligibility or bureaucracy kind of position. Because for the board, if the board kind of started to give in on a moral thing and start to maybe adjudicate claims around deservingness and fairness, that introduces a lot of mess and a lot of discretion, and it would become quite unwieldy. And so the board, I think, doesn't want to, go there. So they're becoming, as they're confronted with these moral arguments, it may in fact function to sort of further entrench the board in its position around eligibility and standardized processes and non-discretionary adjudication of claims. And then, this is just sort of back to, by applying that sick role lens to this data, it could really allow us to see work injury as a social role that in society comes attached with expectations and can really create these moral tensions within injured workers around sensing this expectation to get well and get back to work. But for some injured workers, that's a big struggle, and many can't do that. They cannot get back to work and be those sort of good neoliberal citizens. And I also talked about sort of, these sorts of things might be generalized to other sorts of phenomena or contexts. So the worker-centered collective and the influence of that on injured workers' claims. So being a part of the injured worker movement that gave them the language and ideas for thinking about their claim. One might consider the presence of a worker-centered collective in other kinds of contexts, and how the role and influence of that. And similarly, I talked about the sacred text, which is the Meredith report and principles, and how that really functioned as a shared authority on compensation, which is referred to all the time in the injured worker community, but it's also referred to by the board in different ways, right? It's used in different ways. And it was really interesting, as part of my analysis, I looked at the Meredith Principles that the injured worker community circulates, and then the list that's on the Association for Workers' Compensation Boards of Canada, which is what's basically linked to from the compensation board. So the WSIB, when they talk about Meredith Principles, they link to this other website. And while on the surface they're similar lists, they're not mirror images of each other. There are differences there that reflect these different takes on workers' compensation. So, and especially in the injured workers kind of list, there's language there around blame and is it beyond a doubt, and there's language in there that really elevates the justice piece. And then there's language that's absent from the comps list, which sort of, there's language that's removed around employer responsibility or board responsibility and so on. If we want to, we can bring them up and look at them. But, so it's really interesting to sort of see that we have these shared principles that everybody's talking about, but when push comes to shove, the actual language is a little bit different, and it really kind of, it advances the interests of the two groups in different ways. So again, in other contexts, you might look at, is there another shared text that's become a bit of an authority that people are, like in other provinces, for example, is there something else that's really kind of guiding practices and understandings? So then I sort of put forth, a little bit, just sort of perhaps food for thought or considerations, I suppose you can call them recommendations, for ways forward for injured workers and the WSIB. And so suggesting that the board can consider how its discourse and practices are perceived by injured workers. So thinking about what its public texts convey, and exploring, perhaps in consultation with injured workers and their representatives, how these public texts might be phrased differently, to incite different kinds of reactions to them. And examine the main sites of tension and ways to improve relations. And we've seen the success of that to some extent in the past. The challenge, of course, is always sustaining these things. So the stigma project that was done a few years ago, right? And the board was really interested in hearing about that and implementing some changes. Now, how long those changes sort of stick around before they kind of, that's a real challenge. And I think that could actually be a really nice avenue for research to see how, if changes are implemented, are they sustained? Or do they evolve or morph somehow? What does that look like within an institution, right? because if we're suggesting these changes, it's interesting to see how they actually get taken up. And, whoops. And so I know through the Stigma Project, for example, they did training with frontline workers and adjudicators and so on around sort of turning the mirror on themselves to think about how they might be having assumptions around injured workers and how that's affecting how they adjudicate claims and all that. And exploring ways to align their policies with prevailing discourses. So within my thesis, I did an analysis of the early and safe return to work program and how that really creates these tensions with the sick role, right? Because with the sick role, you should take time off and recover, but the early and safe return to work program is really rushing people back to work, and so it's creating that weird tension I talked about. And, enhanced communication between the two parties to foster understanding of the other's positions. That's, I suppose, I was told in my defense that was a bit naive. But I think there's always room to open those lines of communication, and for example, the board to bring back to the table injured workers and injured worker representatives when they're making decisions and revising policies and so on. And then lastly, I just considered ways forward for research, and suggested again further exploring ways other compensation policies and programs might collide with dominant discourses. Examine whether injured workers might conceive, claiming, or argue their cause in other terms, and whether there might be any value in that. And I know I've been at meetings where the conversation was around maybe taking more of a human rights approach, really kind of framing this as about human rights, right? Or making the business case. And I know I've seen the documents coming out of ANIWIG and injured workers consultants who do that, make the business case. Basically, that there's a business case here for supporting injured workers the way they were meant to be supported. And then I added this one because it seemed quite timely, to investigate the processes that contribute to opioid addictions among injured workers with problematic claims. So recognizing the deep suffering that people with problematic claims have, and oftentimes leads to addictions that started out as treating their injury, but these addictions come about, and looking at how that intersects with just the problematic claim itself and the struggles with the process and how that's connected to the development of an addiction. And then finally, what was absent from my work was the claiming discourse and role of employers. So, I heard from directly injured workers. It was their perspective I was most interested in. And of course, they spoke about the board, and they also spoke about employers. It wasn't just the board that they kind of had tensions with. It was employers too. But I didn't, and while I sort of looked to the texts, documents of the board to get some understanding of the board's perspective, I didn't explore the employer kind of position. And I think that would be a really interesting piece to add to this little tiny piece of the bigger picture, is to get the employer perspective on things. But of course, it's oftentimes very difficult to get the employers, to get their side of things. So that's a methodological challenge, I guess, or a recruitment challenge. But so that's it.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to talk about anything in more detail or answer any questions or.
John, can I get a question in?
Okay, I'll put you on the list, John. No, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Me first?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Dana. It's John Ray. I wish I was there in person. You raised a number of questions. I'm going to stick to one.
Okay.
But a couple of observations first. I think it's nice that you took the position of injured workers rather than focusing on the board or focusing on employers. I think it's nice that somebody takes our side for a change. I was delighted by that. The second observation is the what you call the tensions. I might call the disconnect between the sick role, the expectations of us getting well, whereas a permanent disability often prevents that. So it's just an unrealistic expectation. But what I want to ask about is in your province, the whole question of representation with, a lot of the health. I don't think you have that in Newfoundland, Labrador. So who represents injured workers who want to fight the system? It's a very daunting process.
So in Newfoundland, it's certainly a much smaller kind of network, right? But there is the Office of the Worker Advisor, which is connected to, it's sort of part of the Newfoundland Labrador Federation of Labour. And there are basically a couple of worker advisors who you can imagine are incredibly busy.
I can't, yeah.
Bernie Coffey is one, and she's just retired, but she's been doing it for a very long time. And of course, you know, to hear her talk about it, you know, it would sound like she's just inside your head. You know, it's very, of course, similar stories and experiences in Newfoundland, Labrador. I was lamenting to Orlando, though, that, you know, in the year and a half or so that I've been back, I don't sense that there's near the level of a community movement that's, I mean, Ontario is really fantastic in regards to the injured worker community that's here and the supports and, you know, that collective action. But I've really struggled to identify any kind of a collective in Newfoundland and Labrador, so I fear that by and large injured workers are feeling quite isolated in their claims and in their fight around their claim. So as I say, these worker advisors are just incredibly busy fighting on their behalf.
This business of community is something that we face across the country, whether involving injured workers or the rest of the disability rights movement. We're just not as strong as we need to be, or we're not as cohesive as we need to be.
Yeah.
And of course, as you pointed out, you know, the system does not involve us to the extent that we need to be involved, and that I think would make some difference. But
Yeah.
that, of course, is another major disconnect. Anyway, enjoyed your presentation. I wish I was there to chat with you indirectly, but could you? Glad I was able to join. Thanks so much.
Thank you, John. And I was at the conference on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I saw you speak Tuesday night, and it was really nice to see you up there talking and reflecting on the strategy as well. I really appreciated your contribution there.
I enjoyed your comments as well, and I'm going to send the organizers some reflections, because with the time that I had, I didn't have time to cover all of the things that that I think are missing from that strategy.
Yeah.
I think the strategy misses most of the burning issues of the day, and the people that I talked to on Wednesday, who said they liked my presentation, tell me, Dana, that I was way too nice when I spoke, and I got to fix that. Anyway, I enjoy hearing your presentation as well. So
Thanks, John.
good to make this connection thing. I'm gonna go.
Okay.
Okay, bye, John.
Dana, you probably said it, and I probably missed it, but the claimants that you looked at, what time period, was it all after 1990?
It was after 1997,
1997?
which I think was the most recent iteration of the Act.
Okay.
So I think that's how I sort of decided that I wanted to make sure I was talking to people who were kind of operating within the most recent version of the Workplace Health and Safety Act, whatever. Yeah.
So did you get a sense during your research what people felt like, I guess even before 1990 under the pension system, if there was a difference in the discourse at the boards, from the sense of the board and from the sense of workers? Probably not.
I didn't get that sort of historical kind of picture at all, really. Which is interesting, because a member of my doctoral committee was Lynn Holness, who worked at the board, I think, during the period that you were describing. So she would bring a little bit of historical context from time to time, and brought in some sort of publications or whatever, like little pamphlets and fact sheets that had been produced by the board at that time. And I took a peek at it, but I must say I didn't spend a great deal of time considering that. It was really sort of focusing on the period in which I was collecting the data, really. Yeah.
Sorry.
I have, thank you so much for, going through all of this. I didn't know you during the whole period of the research, so,
Right.
It's great to see everything from the start. I have, so, what, I really like John said, about, taking a look at the workers' comp system from, a moral angle, as told by injured workers.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to the gaps and, the sort of problems with the compensation system as itself. So it's sort of like a critique of the compensation system. And I know that you were focusing on like injured worker interactions, but I think you can paint a picture of what is up with the board and with the workers' comp system, and so I like that, and I think that like comes out, and like I'm part of the Research Action Committee, and we made like a little blurb on that sort of thing about how that illustration of the board comes out through injured worker story. I think that's really great. I have sort of a thing about the. I was wondering if, like you had an individualized, like, this is what I'm sensing, so you can correct me, of like understanding injured worker engagement one-on-one, like one person with a board, but I was wondering if you had like a sort of like a community aspect to it of injured workers as a whole, like interacting, and how that played a role with individuals understanding their interactions with board. Why I'm asking that is because I was wondering, like, one of the things that I was looking forward to was like listening to resistance, like some sort of theme around like individual resistance and like communal resistance to what, like, to sort of the injustice, especially around like when people are engaging morally. I think the community also like interacts with how that came about, and I'm wondering if you saw that. The second one is like, I was wondering if there was an interaction between like pain, suffering, like mentally, physically, and also the poverty that comes with that, because you said it was 20% of the claimants that you saw, but and I feel like they're mostly people are really suffering in deep poverty, and I was wondering how that came across and how that played a role with the understanding of that moral engagement, because that's so huge, and that like that makes people very vulnerable to like and forms their thought. Okay, I'm gonna go on, and the next part is the next part is like the sick role discourse and the neoliberal discourse. I've worked with the sick role discourse, and I sort of critique it a little just because I don't like the promotion of that discourse. It's really old, and I think people like it just gets played over and over again, and it also like plays a role with the neoliberal discourse. It doesn't go well, and I liked how you were talking about how that creates those tensions between the board and people. And I was wondering if you could illustrate how the second and the third points like got together, because like I know sick role is not really based on neoliberalism, but it does.
Yeah, for sure. I see them as related too. So I'll start with the sick role and then work my way back up. Totally agree. You know, Joan, my supervisor, and I tossed around the sick role, and we thought, really? Like, it was introduced in 1951 and has received plenty of criticism in the sociological literature, oftentimes because it doesn't fit. So it doesn't work for people with chronic disability, for example, or chronic illness, because that piece that expects you to get better can't possibly be accomplished. But that's what we thought made the sick role really interesting. It was the fact that it didn't fit, and it doesn't work in certain contexts. But it's still applying that lens. Still, while it doesn't fit perfectly, it really allowed me to see my data in a particular way. It allowed me to see that dance. You know, it sort of just illuminated that there are these sort of underlying expectations that we feel when we're sick about, like, I really got to kind of get back to work here, you know, or I'll have a doctor's note. This is legit. I'm not making that, you know, like these sorts of things that we, you know, take up. And applying that very old sick role, to me, by doing that, it sort of revived it for me and kind of made me see that it still has use in sociological inquiry of health and sickness, because the fact that it doesn't fit doesn't mean that you have to just sort of discard it. It actually brings out things in your data around the fact that it doesn't fit. So it creates those tensions, right? So injured workers, like people with chronic illness sometimes, can't meet all those expectations of the sick role. And for sure, I mean, when you're writing a thesis, of course, or sort of organizing your ideas, you make 1,001 decisions. And my supervisor and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to represent my analysis around sick role and neoliberalism. Do I collapse them into one chapter, or do I keep them separate? Because they are so interrelated, right? Like, in the sick, you can see the sick role sort of playing out in the neoliberal context, because they both they frame what it is to be a good citizen, right? We're all supposed to be as healthy as possible and ready to work and contributing and working to be the most competitive, productive member of society. These are sort of the unspoken but kind of that discursive sort of ideas that are circulating there in neoliberalism, and you can see them in the sick role too. So there are other ways that I could have represented that sort of connection between the two, but I chose to pull them apart and talk about them separately, though I think I do add language in there that it nods to their kind of interrelationship. But I sort of saw slightly different things happening, that I didn't want the sick role piece to get sort of gobbled up by the neoliberal piece. So I really wanted to highlight, well, basically work injury as a social role. That's what the sick role brought, and why I wanted to keep it separate, as opposed to just a medical status, like I'm injured. You know what I mean? So does that answer sort of your question around that? All of the injured workers talked about the financial hardship and poverty and burning through their retirement and losing homes and a lot of dissolved marriages and strained relationships with children, and the stories were a lot of suffering, right? And the poverty came through, but that didn't come out as sort of the key story for me, or at least that wasn't, through all of my reading and analysis, that wasn't the piece that I pulled on in terms of the story I was going to tell in my thesis. But it certainly was very present there, right? And those things came through for me around, I guess, through that identity work, right? When people talked about, like, I'm hurting, like, big time, and really resisting the insinuation or implication that people who are on compensation are just sort of fraudulent, or I keep saying milking the system or looking for a free ride, as though being on compensation is some sort of glamorous kind of thing, like where people are really living the big life. Like, the same thing with welfare. You always hear about the smoking cigarettes and eating popcorn on the couch, like this sort of prevailing notion, And so I framed people's talk about suffering and poverty and all that kind of stuff as part of their injury narrative, of course. But to me, my analysis of that was resisting these ideas that this is somehow a cushy existence or an easy existence, or that I would not be doing this unless I absolutely had to be, right? That this is an absolute necessity for me. And then around the resistance piece, it's so cool. Now I wish I could go back and rethink about things, like to really focus on that resistance. So I have a chapter around the injured worker movement and the justice discourse. And I talk a little bit about just the strength of that movement and what they've accomplished. I kind of summarized Robert Story's excellent work around kind of following the history of the compensation system and the injured worker movement. And I wanted to have that there to sort of really illustrate the strength of the movement and the collective kind of activism, and then how that is reflected in the stories I heard from injured workers. I don't know, maybe I regret that I don't think I sufficiently maybe reflected on the individual resistance as it relates to the collective resistance. I think that would have been a really cool thing. So the resistance I talked about more was that one-on-one stuff of the adversarial relations with the board and the fight. And probably one of the times I came here years ago, when my stuff was all sort of half-baked, I was really toying with all that battle fight language. Like, to me, that just jumped out, And I was really trying to sort of take my thesis in that direction and have that be the kind of central focus. But all the other stuff that was coming out, I just couldn't piece it all together, so I sort of reframed things a little bit. But Yeah, I think that would be really, really cool. So I talk about, I think, some of the successes of the movement and the language and all that kind of thing that influences individual workers, but I like that idea. I'm going to make a note of that.
It's actually maybe a good segue to Steve Mantis in Thunder Bay, and I don't know, you may have addressed this already, but a few minutes back he asked if we could explore a little bit further about where I assume he means Oniwig Injured Worker Movement strategies, where our strategies or which strategy or approach might resonate more with the board in terms of resulting in positive change, and if there's any way that the research that you've done here informs that.
Yeah.
You may have just addressed that sort of, but
Well, because I think that was what, in Joan's reaction to my piece, she sort of hinted at that something to think about out of this research is how the board possibly could be reacting to a moral argument, which is kind of making them dig in more possibly, because the notion of kind of adjudicating claims on a moral basis is probably very scary. I mean, it would just be administratively, they would argue, I'm sure, impossible, to adjudicate claims according to justice and deservingness. What would that even look like, So I don't know. I think that's a conversation for around the table around other possible framings or other ways to engage with claiming that might cause less sort of take down walls rather than put up walls or something. I'm not sure, but
Now that really struck me too,
Yeah.
the realization, because we've been strong proponents of developing the justice discourse. My thinking has been we have to beat that into the brains of the people running the system, and it hadn't occurred to me that it could have the opposite result. That's just something that I'm thinking about, but also I'm thinking that trying to reframe the system from workers' compensation to insurance has also facilitated that standardization,
Yes.
bureaucratization thing. Because, like with insurance, if your basement gets flooded, well, maybe yours is covered, Rachel, and yours isn't, Orlando, because that's the policy you got, and that's just the way it is. Tough luck. Whereas, with the work injury, we think that all the injuries should be covered. So, the insurance model really facilitates that.
and it's a two-way street really, because it's probably around the time that they shifted to more of an insurance model that the injured worker community really started to come out with a real justice kind of discourse. Like it was in response to that shift at the board. So it's sort of, it's co-producing responses to claiming or engagement with claiming. So it's, I don't know that any of us have the answers around the best strategy going forward. But I think there's something there to be thought about in any case around if we go at it this way, these are the possible kinds of implications of that.
Yeah. Just one affirmation, I guess, is your suggestion about maybe in some way talking more about human rights than justice is also very timely, because the board is sensitive to allegations that it's in breach of human rights obligations. So even though that might not be the way we frame the issues, that may be a way in with the board.
Yeah.
So those are useful suggestions. I really like the moral versus the efficiency.
Yeah.
It has allowed me to open up conversations during my hearings, because as you say, the system now is, well, there's a very tight rule, and you either fit or you don't fit. And don't talk to me about anything else, because it's irrelevant. Do you fit or don't you fit under this particular very narrow policy? And I've referred to your paper. I said, well, how does the injured worker see this? And injured workers see it in moral terms. And if you want to read the paper, here is the reference. But anyway, the injured worker sees it like this. Has it been fair? And it's important for you to consider this. So it opens up the discourse incredibly in ways that you cannot be stopped to say, well, wait a second, let's talk about whether it fits or not.
Yeah.
So the other issue, we shouldn't be afraid, in my view, you talk about the board needing to be moral, of course that word has been kidnapped by the right wing, but it's a good word because by asking them to be moral, it doesn't mean that we're asking them to pay on demand. We're just saying apply the rules in the way they were intended, which are open, benefit of doubt. That's part of the discourse. It doesn't mean the stereotype of them, well, somebody's injured, here's the money, throw money at them, right? That's what the right wing says. That's not what we're asking. So I wanted to just mention something else about the sick roll, which is very intriguing. Because the first time I saw sick roll, I thought, wait a second, sick roll? I read that a lot in board files denying the claim. Because they're saying, she's playing the sick role.
Performing.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Don't.
That's really interesting, Orlando.
That's the first thing that I got concerned about. However, the way you explain it is very useful. But there's, that concept is going to jump out. And I'm glad that Audrey asked the question, when have you looked at, injured workers? And you mentioned 97, 98, which is Bill 99. And so your perspective is very useful because you're looking at it from a bit of a distance. We're too close to it, right? So both are kind of reinforce each other. But what happened in 1998? So you need to be kind of involved in the legalities of the bill to understand this. But they eliminated the concept that there are temporary total benefits and temporary partial benefits. Key thing, because forever and ever, the board said, you're injured, temporary total benefit.
Right.
No questions asked.
Yeah.
Sick roll, we're not going to question, because right after the injury you have an acute phase. So you just recover.
Yeah.
But now it's eliminated. And now you can ask somebody to return to work during the acute period.
Right.
And your role is to just be available to go back to work, whether you need to be on a stretcher or not. And then, so what the board did before is, after a while, if your doctor says that you're now ready to do some work, you're on the temporary partial stage, and then the permanent disability stage. So that differentiation allowed the sick role to, you're sick. We're not going to ask any questions, right? So they eliminated that, and that brought about the mess where people are asked to return to work when they're not ready.
Yes.
And the family doctor's designation no longer counts.
Right.
So that was an important change.
Yes.
So. Anyway, so I don't know. The question is for you how you can continue this very important work, because it has benefited us very well. And maybe employers are an interesting. Well, first of all, thank you for looking at injured workers, because they're often ignored. But it'd be interesting to hear what employers have to say, because I think the board is playing games with them too. And they may not like to be visited and be told, get this person back, when they can look and they know, I don't know if the worker is ready yet. So there may be something there.
Yeah, and what I really wanted to try and do was I wanted to avoid as much as possible sort of finger pointing. And I really wanted to situate everybody within this broader context that's really shaping everyone's understandings and practices. And I don't remember if it actually made it into my thesis, but something I was working on for a while was, originally all this moral engagement for the workers was coming out of my data, and I said, oh wow, this is really about moral. And then I said, well, the board is completely amoral. That was the dichotomy I had going in my mind. And I'd have these meetings with my supervisor John, and we'd be talking about it, and then we kind of had this light bulb moment where we said, well, in fact, the board could also argue that it is acting morally, because this was in a time, this is around 2009, 2010, during a time of extreme austerity, after the big recession in 2008, when organizations were really tightening their belts, and people were really celebrating austerity and finding ways to cut costs and trim expenses, and it was a time of austerity. And during that time, I think many would have said that the board was behaving morally by being very responsible sort of stewards and administrators of these sort of funds. You know what I mean? So the board might have been able to argue for itself that it too was acting very morally. So, and then thinking about that more and more is what led me to sort of more neoliberal context in which the board was operating, and the pressures on the board from the ministry, for example, to get its unfunded liability in check and so on, which is then shaping all, it kind of just keeps pushing down and then shaping those practices at the local level, right? It all just sort of gets quite, I forget the word now, but it sort of filters throughout, right? So yeah, and I suspect, I would place employers in a similar sort of place where they're being, of course, they've got their own competing demands that are, all these sorts of incentives that are shaping their behaviors. Not that these practices are great, and they're certainly not good for injured workers, like claims suppression, and is not good for injured workers, and finding ways to get around experience rating, all this sort of stuff. But what I really try to do is situate all that stuff in the broader context that's really shaping these understandings and practices, right?
I think the moral justice discourse argument, is also a really interesting one, and I also hadn't considered that impact of like what does that argument do in terms of the response from the board, and like my initial reaction to that question of like what do we do with that dilemma, like my initial reaction is just that like we have to do better at it then, like because in terms of like movement building, I think our only leverage is the moral and the justice discourse. Like we can't win an argument with the WSIB on technicalities. It's not possible. There's too much bureaucratic machinery, and there's too much ability for them to be able to spin stuff. Our power is the ability to for people to tell their stories and to show the injustice. And I think for me, in terms of like how do we push back and build a movement that can bring transformative change to the system, the question is just how do we do that better then? It isn't how do we like change or like shift the way that we engage in these debates or whatever with the WSIB or with whatever compensation system. It's about being stronger at it.
And with deeming, a reform for deeming has taken into consideration the moral aspect, but also we haven't said anybody is going to be paid. Like we've put some structures there so that like we don't want people. We have clarified that it's not just pay on demand.
And to add to Aiden's point, Robert Story wrote a paper, and you've summarized it, about their only power was moral, or is that
It's the DVD, but I think he's
then he also has a paper on that. But if you look at the history of the movement, it's holding that moral identity, sort of with that perspective going forward. And I also think that especially the rights-based approach, that's, and with John saying that the board is becoming aware of them suppressing people's rights. It could be at a point politically where we can target it, but also I was wondering if you could use a different human rights based approach, but it's also moral. So
for sure,
it's still going to hit people morally. And I think also one of the things you talked about was you wanted to face the first point as Meredith's discourse, and you didn't. Man, that's really interesting, because when you do research about injured workers, you know that they talk about Meredith so much, and then you said, okay, but the board also has Meredith, how is it read so differently? And that is also I think it brings to the origins of when Meredith wrote it. He was writing, yes, for justice for injured workers, but he was also trying to find a place where employers and it could also be a business case. So so that there's two roles there of that, and it can be read differently. But at the end of the day, it was to support injured workers.
I mean, it's interesting because the Meredith report, there's no tidy list of principles. They are extracted by the injured worker community and by the compensation boards, right? So it was interesting to see how that was done, and the subtle differences between the two lists or whatever.
Yeah, Robert Story wrote about that, about how the different sort of interest groups
Yeah, take up.
take, different lists of Meredith Principles. And but I mean, there's some dishonesty in there too. Like, it's partly different groups absorbing different things
Yeah,
out
yeah.
of Meredith, but Meredith did say compensation for as long as disability lasts, and
Yes.
ever since they cut it off at age 65,
Right.
people just, it's like that's been redacted out of his report.
Yes.
And it's there in black and white, and
Yeah.
it's undeniable, and yet it's not in any list of Meredith Principles by anyone other than injured workers. So that's
It's telling.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we were having similar sorts of conversations at the conference a couple of days ago around what do we do? How do we do this better? How do we keep this momentum, or how do we get some momentum or something? And I don't know. I mean, I get it's baby steps, unfortunately, right? A lot of the times. I mean, my sense is certainly around the labor reporting out of Ontario. That I feel like it's become a lot more frequent. And to what I've been reading in any case, largely out of the Star, it's very worker oriented, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's taking a terrible. I mean, it's not particularly kind to the board at all, right? So that's positive, and I guess just sort of that more public campaign, right? Like getting the public on board and establishing pressure somehow that way. And I know that you have a ton of activities around that, right? But that was sort of a conversation that was had at the conference as well around these sort of public campaigns around and imagery of just sort of changing these discourses, like attacking that discourse of abuse, you know, and that's not going to happen overnight, but it's I think it has to happen at that level. It's a discursive level in many these sort of big prevailing ideas, you know, and how do we chip away at them, and do we look to can we think of other kinds of shifts, and how do they accomplish that, you know, as a step, where you could totally keep that moral argument, and just sort of, I guess, how that's put out into the world, I suppose.
Steve wonders if it's about tailoring our messages to different audiences, to workers. It's justice, to the WSIB, and the current government, it's something different.
I had a question just about some of the stats that you cited at the beginning. So you talked about 40 to 90% of work injuries going unreported, and 20% of claims being, like the term used, as being problematic, but they account for 80% of costs. Those would be, I think, helpful stats for us to be able to work into the, stuff that we're doing on the organizing front. So I'm just wondering, are those stats specific to Ontario, and B, where did they come from?
They're not specific to Ontario, and they came from a dozen or more references, right? So this was sort of my summary of, like I read a study around back injury that says 35% of back injury in hotel workers is not reported, and then something else, and then I might read a systematic review that says, on the whole, as much as 90%. So it was sort of aggregation on my part, but I could certainly, I think without too much work, send you the appropriate references and probably even highlight sort of the things I drew on to establish those kinds of numbers, right? The 2080 thing about came from Ellen McKecken's work, and I'm pretty sure it was the toxic dose piece, which you might be familiar with, right? Where she sort of talks about this kind of, it's basically looking at these long drawn out claims and the toxic dose of all the sort of, rehab and whatnot, just all the various steps in the process winds up harming injured workers. And I think it's where she cites that stuff as well. But
Yeah, that'd be great,
The thing with 80-20 split, the lights just went on, and to my mind, with your conceptualization of the board's sort of neoliberal business case analysis, is that they probably think that there's a problem here. We got 20% of the people taking up 80% of the money. We got to fix that.
The number.
Yeah. So,
Which has been their approach.
yeah, I mean, we've always been aware of that, and that's perfectly reasonable because only 10 to 20% of people with work injuries really need a compensation board.
Yeah.
Most people don't miss any time from work or are off temporarily and their life isn't thrown
Yeah.
on the rocks.
Mhm.
But the fact that there's a whole bunch of people who just automatically
Yeah.
assume this is wrong,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting.
I would, Steve always asks very good questions. So in response to his question, I would say that our discourse needs to be a justice discourse plus.
Mhm.
So whatever audience we go, we begin with the basics, which happens to be correct and true. And the Meredith report, by the way, is not in metaphors like the Bible is, which is open to different interpretations. It's pretty clear, and it's 26 pages.
Yeah.
So you can extract that it's a justice discourse from that. But plus, right? So if we're in a business audience, we can say, well, justice discourse plus look at all the money that is shifted into social assistance and so on and so forth, right? There's basically two discourses, two main ones. It's the justice discourse or the business case. I'm not sure there's a lot of intermediate discourses, but I think we can do a little bit of business case, only as a plus though. I wouldn't make it substitute the
Yes.
justice case.
Yeah. That's a really that's
Or
interesting
call it
idea.
a Meredith case as appropriate, because it goes back to
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
grandfather.
There were two really interesting ideas for future research there. One comes from Audrey's question about the year that people were hurt, and in terms of trying to think about what if we had a blank slate and were to design a good workers' comp system, what would that look like? It's important to know, I think, the same things that you've learned from the group that you looked at from other systems, because one of the things that we know, like from the pre-1990 pension system, is that economically there's not as much poverty among that group, and we saw that in our own observations as we were helping people, but also that's been confirmed by statistical analysis, and so that got me wondering, like, could someone replicate your research? Because we have a whole cluster of willing pre-1990 injured workers in Perry Ballantyne's sample
Right.
that she's already talking to, and they're willing to talk. And like, if just wondering, would it be worthwhile for someone to replicate your interview process with that group? And would it have to be you to come up with the comparable analysis for the pre-1990 group, or could someone else apply the same thought process? I don't know.
I'd say either, probably. I mean, either would work, right? So would we be asking to reflect on their experience pre-1990, or to talk from their current sort of position, having initiated a claim pre-1990? Do you know what I mean? Like, are we asking them to reflect back on 1993? Or would we be asking them, where they are now, but bearing in mind that that claim was initiated pre-1990? Do you know what I mean?
And I was thinking part of that too is to look at relatively what was the position of the Workers' Compensation Board as it was known at that time. Is it any richer, any poorer? What changed? The shift, and why are people being treated so horrible right now? Like, the board is not. My sense is that the board is not any poorer than it was relatively pre-1990.
And when was
Return,
Steve? When did
you know what I
Steve
mean?
sit on the board? I mean, Steve was a worker rep on the board for a while, right? When?
Yeah.
What period was that?
1990. Steve will probably correct us, but
Yeah. Because
In 5 minutes. When,
Because a question of mine is,
First
did
part
they
of
have
it.
worker representatives on their board then?
well, he actually recently was talking somewhere about that experience, and I remember him saying that the worker representatives at the board meetings wanted to raise issues about these problems that workers are having, and the board and the staff said, we don't have room for that. We've got multi-million-dollar administrative expenses, and
Yes.
there's a lot of big important decisions that have to be made here, and you don't have time to listen to what's the problem with injured workers. So
Just hear from the people that you're ostensibly here to support.
yeah, what was important to
Yeah.
them was these multi-million-dollar decisions
Right.
about systems and processes
Right,
and
right.
things. And that really struck me.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, certainly to get that historical perspective and how system changes obviously are reflected then in individual experience. And another sort of parallel sort of research project that I discussed a lot with my committee was somehow tapping into injured workers who, if they exist, aren't connected to an injured worker group, right? They're out there. If they're out there with a problematic claim, what's the likelihood that they're not supported or connected to a group? I don't know. They're harder to get because they're not connected, and you just, in terms of literally getting your recruitment materials out there, it's difficult to know how to reach these people who are sort of just operating all alone and trying to figure out how to do this. But it would be, I wonder, would they see claiming morally? Would they engage with the system in the moral terms if they're not really tuned into Meredith? You know?
I mean, I would bet they would have a different language set, but I think
Yeah.
that, I mean, that kind of struck me about the discussion. I think whether they use the term moral and whether they're using terms like extracted from Meredith or communicated through something like a speaker school. We meet lots of workers who are not yet and perhaps never engage in injured worker groups or in any of the education that Alien League offers, who are definitely, the predominant dialogue is like something is wrong.
Right.
Like this is what's happening here is not right.
And
which
they're
is
perceiving it
which is I mean that's essentially
That's really
morality.
interesting. That's really interesting to hear, because I always sort of had this sneaking concern, you know, that I'm talking about injured workers here, but
Right.
and through my thesis I had to be, I don't know if you picked up on it, but you know, I was clear to say that these workers are connected. They're
Right.
connected to the movement, and they are influenced in some ways by that discourse, the justice discourse. And there's always this sort of lingering question in my mind, well, what about the injured workers who aren't really kind of wrapped up in all of this, who are sort of out there floating around and figuring it out, and are they seeing it in the same way? And I always felt a tad tormented that I didn't feel I had that perspective, you know, so it's really
Different words, but the same general.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
they're
same
having the same
results.
experiences, right?
Yeah.
So you know, that makes sense. Our online audience is dwindled, so I may end the streaming part of it. Obviously,
Sure.
we can hang out
Yeah,
and. But thanks to everyone who was watching online, and we'll send around links for the archived version of that.
You know Steve?
No, Steve's probably still there, but you can call it.
He's how loyal.
I don't know. There's somebody watching at this point. But it could be me actually. So
Might be my mom. She's not watching.